Of the 195 countries that make up the world today, none is as big as Russia. Spanning over 5,600 miles, from the small enclave of Kaliningrad to the west to Big Diomede Island in the east, Russia encompasses 11 time zones and a total of 6,612,074 square miles. It is in fact so large that the second biggest nation on Earth, Canada, could fit within its borders over 1.7 times. For well over 300 years, Russia, in one form or another, has maintained its position as the world's largest country, and during the height of its territorial expanse, in the year 1866, stretched all the way from Poland to Alaska. However, just a few centuries earlier, a recognizable Russian state did not even exist. Amongst the patchwork of warring principalities and dukedoms that made up the region, emerged the first glimpses of a nation that, through the ambitions and endeavors of Cossacks and Tsars alike, would rise to become the largest nation on Earth. This is how Russia became the world's biggest country. For the purpose of understanding the emergence of the Russian state and its expansion, it is most important to focus on the geographical region of European Russia, that is, the smaller section of the country that lies west of the Ural Mountains. Much of this area is dominated by the river Volga and its tributaries, and is where the country's major cities like Moscow, Kazan, Samara, Volgograd and Astrakhan can be found. An established country, or nation-state, would not emerge here fully until medieval times, but the vast plains of the Pontic-Caspian steppe were home to an array of different Indo-European and Germanic tribes over the centuries. These included the Scythians in ancient Greek times, followed by tribes such as the Sarmatians, the Huns and the Goths, who would go on to threaten and later destroy the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 5th centuries AD. This region began to emerge with some territorial cohesion and cultural similarity in the 9th and 10th centuries, owing to the expansion of the Norse out of Scandinavia. Although the Vikings are more commonly associated with their raids and conquests of Britain and Western Europe, they were much more active in Eastern Europe during this time. Having sailed across the Baltic Sea and down the great rivers of the Volga, Don and Dnieper, they entered the Black and Caspian Seas and went on to launch raids against the Byzantine Empire and Arab caliphates. Over time, these transient Norsemen began to settle more permanently on the banks of the rivers which they traversed, laying the foundations of cities like Kiev, Novgorod and Staraya Ladoga, which they governed as small independent city-states. The Norse rulers of these settlements, who were known as the Rus, gradually assimilated with the local Slavic population and subsequently expanded their territories to form the first large-scale states in the region, such as the Kievan Rus state of late 9th century and later the Novgorod Republic of the 12th century. By the 13th century, the republics and principalities which had emerged along the banks of the rivers and lakes of western Russia, like Novgorod, Pskov, Tver, and the Duchy of Muscovy, had grown prosperous with trade and commerce. Novgorod in particular benefited from close trade links with the Hanseatic League of merchant cities across the Baltic Sea and North Sea. By the year 1223, however, a threat to this period of relative peace and prosperity had emerged from the east: the Mongols. These nomadic horsemen from Asia had swept westward across the Eurasian steppe under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, conquering every city that crossed their path. They successfully engaged a coalition of the Rus principalities at the Battle of the Kalka River, but then withdrew their forces back east. They would return, however, 14 years later, and would subjugate almost all of the southern lands of the Rus, razing cities like Kiev to the ground in 1240 and incorporating its lands into their own as a vassal of the Golden Horde. The majority of the northern Rus principalities escaped such a destruction by submitting to the Mongols, whose hold over western Russia continued for the next 2 centuries, with several khanates being established along the lower courses of the rivers Volga and Don. The Golden Horde, the Crimean Khanate, and the Khanate of Kazan exerted great power and influence across the region and extracted heavy tributes from the northern Rus cities and territories, such as Muscovy and Novgorod, that were not formally under their control. The Mongol Khanates across Asia were in decline by the start of the 15th century, as new powers like the Ottomans in the Middle East and the Ming dynasty in China rose to prominence. In Russia, the rising power was that of the Duchy of Muscovy, which during the reign of Ivan III between 1462 and 1505 launched a series of campaigns against the Khanate of Kazan to wrestle control of the upper reaches of the river Volga. Ivan III also conquered Novgorod, as well as the Republic of Pskov and the Principality of Tver, absorbing them into his territory. Thus, by the start of the 16th century, a centralized Russian state of sorts had emerged, which stretched from Lake Ladoga in the north and south along the river Volga. These territorial acquisitions were furthered by his grandson, Ivan IV, otherwise known to history as Ivan the Terrible, who extended Russian rule further south towards the Caspian Sea. In the year 1547, Ivan IV had himself crowned as the first Tsar of all Russia and set in motion a series of events that would initiate Russia's eastward expansion over the Ural Mountains in the coming centuries. This undertaking was initially carried out by small bands of Cossacks from the steppe, a semi-nomadic people who were well regarded for their skills in fighting on horseback. They were thus hired by the Russian authorities to probe further eastward, and under the leadership of figures such as Yermak Timofeyevich, the Cossacks successfully conquered the Sibir Khanate in what is now Kazakhstan. Although their unbridled ambitions would quickly set off a chain of further exploratory journeys deeper into the vast region of Siberia. Within 100 years, Russian explorers had reached the Kamchatka Peninsula on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, and over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, small colonies began to sprout across the region. Further efforts were also made to expand Russian territory to the lands that lay across the mighty Pacific Ocean, with Vitus Bering, a Danish captain and cartographer in the employ of the Russian Navy, being commissioned in 1733 to explore the sea and straits, which were consequently named after him in honour of his achievements. Although the expedition ultimately cost Bering his life, the discovery of the islands and adjacent coastline of Alaska in 1741 enticed further explorations by fur trappers and adventurers to the region, resulting in the lands to be formally claimed by Russia. Despite the impressive accomplishments of eastward expansion during this time, the primary objective of Russia in the 17th century was to develop closer ties with continental Europe, through expanding westwards and ultimately secure access to a warm water port in the Baltic Sea. At the time, Finland and much of the region around what is now the northwestern extremity of Russia were controlled by the Kingdom of Sweden, who also controlled parts of the Baltic states. Russia was consequently reliant on the port of Arkhangelsk in the far north of the country for much of its trade with Europe. However, its position inside the Arctic Circle limited its viability due to the freezing conditions in winter. As a result of this, Russia embarked upon prolonged war against Sweden to acquire new lands in the Baltic Sea region and secure the warm water port it so desperately needed. The Great Northern War, which was fought from 1700 to 1721, saw Tsar Peter I, known to posterity as Peter the Great, defeat the Swedes and in the process claim sovereignty over lands encompassed by the Gulf of Finland, as well as modern-day Estonia and Latvia. With victory secured, Peter the Great subsequently began constructing a great new capital city on the shores of the Baltic Sea, one which he modestly named after himself, St. Petersburg. His reign was also highly significant in other ways, for he undertook a substantial tour of Western Europe earlier in his reign from 1697 to 1698 to learn about the scientific and technological developments taking place there. Upon his return, he emulated what he had witnessed in the West and began modernizing Russia and transforming it into one of the continent's great powers. By the time his reign ended in 1725, Russia had emerged an international major power after years of being a backward and impoverished nation. The expansionist efforts of Peter were solidified later in the 18th century by Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, who wished to see Russian power exerted to the south around the Black Sea. To that end, war was declared against the Ottoman Empire in 1768, and by 1774, Russia had seized control of the cities of Azov and Kerch. From this secured footing, Russia continued to incrementally expand its southern borders at the expense of the Turks in the decades that followed, by marching troops into the Caucasus, the northeastern parts of the Balkans, as well as the Crimean Peninsula. Other territories were also acquired under the reign of Catherine the Great, which were only possible due to the partitions of Poland. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had declined dramatically as a power during the 18th century, and by the 1770s, its three powerful neighbours, Russia, Prussia and Austria, were in a position to effectively divide the nation up between themselves. Over the course of three partitions in 1772, 1793 and 1795, Russia acquired extensive territory comprising most of Ukraine, virtually all of Belarus and Lithuania, as well as a small proportion of eastern Poland. This cemented Russia's position as one of the most formidable and powerful states on the continent, owing chiefly to its sheer size and the innumerable populace that could be called upon to defend it. This flexing of military and imperial might was demonstrated during the Napoleonic Wars, when it was Russia alone amongst the continental powers which was able to successfully withstand the advance of the French Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. Despite suffering an invasion by France in 1812, Russia was able to successfully repel it, principally due to the vastness of its territory and the harshness of its winters, which decimated the ranks of the invading French army. By the time the conflict concluded in 1815, Russia had also benefited from acquiring control of parts of what is now Poland, as well as Finland, which Tsar Alexander I ruled semi-independently of Russia as Grand Duke. Separate conflicts of the early 19th century were fought against the Turks around the Black Sea, as well as the Persians and native tribes of the Caucasus, which saw further Russian gains in these regions. Russia would come to reach the height of its power during the 19th century. This period witnessed a genuine fear amongst Europe's other great powers, particularly Britain, who were concerned that Russia's continuing expansion would come to threaten their colonial interests on the global stage. In the Far East, Russia was able to secure territorial concessions from China in 1861, which led to the founding of Vladivostok, the country's only ice-free port on the Pacific coast. This acquisition became of increasing strategic importance in the years that followed, for in 1867, Russia decided to sell its imperial landholdings in North America, in the shape of Alaska, to the United States for a then relatively modest sum of $7.2 million, equivalent to $151 million in today's money. In order to compensate for the relinquishment of Alaska, Russia decided to pursue its interests further into Central Asia. Although, this shift in strategy inevitably raised concerns amongst the British, who viewed this as encroachment upon their territory of the British Raj in India and Pakistan. The immense diplomatic and military contest that emerged from this has come to be known at the time as the Great Game, which saw both Britain and Russia vie for control and influence over Afghanistan and Persia, the two buffer states between their respective empires. In both instances, Russia's designs were foiled, although they did manage to secure control over the Khanate of Khiva and the Emirate of Bukhara, around what is now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Neither the British or the Russians were ever able to secure direct control over Afghanistan, despite repeated military efforts over the decades. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the dramatic decline of the Ottoman Empire had seen Russia capitalize on the opportunity to seize yet more territory during yet another Russo-Turkish War between 1877 and 1878. Although the Russian advance would come to a halt by the time they reached the Balkans, their proximity to Constantinople and the possibility of seizing the city, along with access to the Mediterranean Sea, posed a genuine threat. Europe's major powers subsequently united at the Congress of Berlin in 1878 to halt any further Russian ambitions in the Balkans and ensure that out of the disintegrating Ottoman Empire would emerge new states like Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia, which were to be free from direct Russian control. For all that Russia had acquired in terms of territory between the 17th and 19th centuries, it nevertheless remained a backward country with a poor economy, especially when compared to its Western contemporaries. The authoritarian political system of Tsarist Russia had also created a tense political atmosphere by the second half of the 19th century, with increasingly radical movements like anarchism and communism finding growing support amongst the people. It was during Russia's disastrous participation in the First World War that the communists seized the opportunity to launch a revolution in 1917. By the end of that year, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, the communists, also known as the Bolsheviks or Reds, had seized control of St. Petersburg and Moscow, but a bitter civil war quickly ensued between them and the less radical elements of Russia's revolutionaries, who were known as the Whites. The end result, when the war came to its conclusion in 1923, was the emergence of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, in which the communists had managed to retain control of the vast majority of the Russian Empire, although Poland, Finland and the Baltic states had used the opportunity to declare independence and once again establish their own nation-states. The very survival of the USSR, however, would quickly be thrown into question with the onset of the Second World War in 1939. The 6-year conflict proved immensely costly for the Soviets, but as the German forces began to withdraw across the Eastern Front in 1943, the Soviets advanced in their wake across Eastern Europe. In the war's aftermath, the USSR was able to annex practically the entire region, with the Baltic states being amalgamated directly as the Soviet Republic, whilst communist vassal states were established across the likes of Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Although the post-war period did not see any further territorial expansion of Soviet Russia, the unfurling Cold War with the United States did see Russian influence be exerted all over the world, with its support of other communist regimes in countries like North Korea, North Vietnam, Cuba, Afghanistan, and many others. Nevertheless, despite the communist propaganda claiming that Soviet Russia was a prosperous socialist republic, by the 1970s and 1980s, the USSR had fallen dramatically behind the United States and other Western powers, as it failed to innovate technologically and develop its economy. Despite the efforts of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Communist Party to reform the Soviet Union, the damage was already done, and in many ways irreversible. In the years that followed, the whole edifice of communism began to collapse, as first the Eastern Bloc countries began to split from Moscow amid increasing calls for the dismantling of the USSR. This duly followed in the course of events of 1990 and 1991, with the USSR being dissolved to make way for an independent Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, and finally, the modern-day Russian Federation itself.